the brief delay. We had some technical difficulties we had to work through, but we got that straightened out. If this is your first time checking out V Radio, make sure you check out my archives. You can go to hy.page/V Radio. You can check me out on all my other mediums. YouTube is just one of them. I also use Kick. I use Twitch. I use BitChute. I basically use everywhere you can go. So you can check me out in all those places and join us on our Discord where we have lively debates with just one major rule of just no personal attack. So today, once again, my guest is Lierre Keith. Lierre Keith is a feminist activist, and we had a great conversation starting earlier. We're going to be delving deeper into that conversation now. I'm going to go ahead and bring her on. Hello, we got it done.
Neil,
Yay!
how you doing? We got it to work.
No problem.
I'm not touching anything until this is over. I have no idea why it didn't work, and I have no idea why it is working. Not touching it.
Yep, we'll just have faith in it and in where it is right now. So
it's all magic. We all know this. It's magic. None of us know how, and there's no way to know how this works.
So we discussed on the previous episode kind of like more of a history of feminism, and then like the real question, I think that was like the burning original question was, when did things start to go awry as far as particularly when it comes to the trans stuff? I did have one question I wanted to ask you first. And this is like from a perspective of like, this is before we get into that stuff, but Jordan Peterson talked about a study that I guess that went on in Iceland where they had done a lot to liberate women and, you know, to make them more equal in the workplace. And he pointed out that he felt that what ended up coming out of that was that even with the free choices, that certain aspects of what would be considered to be traditional gender roles still kind of manifested on their own. Do you believe it's possible that there may be some biological differences that could lead to differences in interests and such?
I don't think we know, and I don't actually think it matters. I think that everybody should be free to have whatever personality they want. And if it turns out in 500 years after we've, you know, gotten rid of all the problems on the planet, like, who knows?
I don't think that we should be making any rules about it, regardless. If a girl wants to be an engineer, a girl wants to be an engineer.
I don't think there should be any stigma, or I don't think anybody should be prevented from being the person who they want to be. If there's boys who want to be ballet dancers, fine. Mikhail Baryshnikov did amazing things on that stage. Like, there should be no problem with boys who want to be dancers, and there should be no problem with girls who want to be engineers. And I don't even know why this is still a conversation in 2023. This just seems insane to me. But I don't know. So I don't know whether there's some, you know, biologically innate things where, you know, there might be like a bell curve where more boys want to do this and more. We don't know. And I don't even care. Like, it shouldn't matter at this point in the game.
Oh, no. And I guess what I was getting at is like whether or not we thought that such a biological imperative could exist. But even if it did, there's going to be outliers. And I'm definitely never going to be a fan of like, because that's one of the major things that I think that feminism got right 100% was that gender roles are kind of silly. Like, you know, let a person be who they want to be, you know. And I'm all about that. And I think that even most conservatives would kind of agree with that for the most part, with the exception of maybe.
I think we've made enough progress that is true, that there's plenty, especially of conservative women who are like, I run my own business. You know, I have my own money. I own my own house. I'm very happy this way. I'm very glad I get to do those things. Like, feminism gave me that. So I think that we have made a lot of progress in those regards. So whether some of this is biological, I don't know. I mean, males and females, men and women have some different brain chemistry. You know, men have way more serotonin than women, for instance, which doesn't seem fair, but it's the way it is. So, you know, our brains do different things. And I don't know what that means in the big world, like whether that means that, you know, more men are going to be attracted to certain things and more women not. We do know around the world that if anybody does something completely insane, it's going to be a teenage boy. Like the crazy stuff. And that's across species.
Sure.
Like, I live in an area where there are mountain lions, and whenever, it's rare that mountain lions attack humans, but every time that they do, it's an adolescent male on his own for the first time. And it's for the same reason that teenage boys do crazy things. For teenagers generally, you know, part of brain development is that your frontal lobes go offline. So that's why teenagers do very risky things, and they really have no concept of long-range consequences. And it's our job as an adults to make that come together and over again so that they actually build those synapses. Eventually, sometime around age 25, your brain is done and your frontal lobes are back online. But this is why around the world, the most crazy and often violent things that get done are by that age range of males. And so I don't know. I mean, that's just like there's no social influence that makes that be different. Like that is just the case about our brains and what we know about testosterone. It does not make men violent. I want everybody to be very clear about that. It doesn't make anybody violent. What it does do, though, is it interferes with access to the frontal lobes. So, in terms of decision making and long range planning and all of that, it can absolutely interfere with those kinds of things. So that's why teenage boys have this reputation for doing, getting drunk and standing on top of the car and driving 90 miles an hour down the whatever, like whatever the crazy elevator surfing, like all that kind of stuff. You just don't see girls doing that. Um, and so
Right.
there's a way that our brains are different. So I don't know what this means in terms of our personalities or, overall our character or the kinds of jobs people are going to want to do in the world. I just don't know. And one of the reasons that I say that is that through history, what we've seen is that if a job is more high status, more men get to do it, fewer women get to do it, it gets paid more. And then as women invade that profession, it drops in status and then it's paid less. And
Mm,
so, really obvious things like we still have positions at the highest level of government that are called things like Secretary of State. And that's because in the year 1776, being a secretary was a very well paid job because only men knew how to read and write. And you had to be of a certain class to be able to get those jobs to have like full literacy. Um, so these were very honorable positions and they were paid very well. And they are, again, the high in the cabinet of the government. You are called secretary of whatever. And now this seems like an anachronism because secretary is one of the lowest paid jobs. So once women took over some of those jobs, started entering those professions, got the literacy and all of that, the position just drops in status and in payment. You saw the same thing with computer programming. In the 1980s, the early 80s, there were more women who actually were doing computer programming than men. And then all these young guys took it over because it was like cool all of a sudden. And in the beginning, it was like, oh, this is a good job for women because it's very detail oriented. And we know that women's brains are good at little tiny details. So we're going to let the girls do this essentially, especially in Eastern Europe. A lot of the computer coding was done by women. And then it got taken over by men. And it became a very hostile place for women to be. And women didn't do it anymore. They left. So now it's this battle to get women back into it. And this is where, like that study that Jordan Peterson likes to quote, I mean, my problem is if you have a society where women don't have to do unpleasant jobs, because there's a really good social safety net, for instance, Scandinavia or Iceland, why would they enter a hostile work environment? It's not that they're not good at it, and it's not even that they necessarily don't want to do it. It's that it's been made such a hostile space that, well, I'll go do something else. This is too hard. And every woman I know who works in those tech industries has just horrendous stories of harassment. And this is in America. So I don't know. I don't think the
well,
study
no,
proves
and I get what you're saying, and it was never going to be about whether or not I was going to say that therefore society should impose limits on anyone. I was never
sure.
going to. It was a question of whether or not such a thing could exist. Like I have a friend who is a female engineer, and she said, "Well, a lot has changed now." She's like, "Because all I've ever encountered is them falling all over themselves to try to get me because, oh, look, a female engineer, awesome, let's grab her." So it's good to see that some awareness of that has happened. But I guess now to get back into now, all right. So you brought up that you had been arguing against the trans stuff like back in like what was it 1982 I think you said. So like
Hmm.
I wasn't
Yeah,
even like that's another thing I think people tend to not be aware of is that this has been going on longer than they think.
a
Like
long time.
right, and that the woke stuff in particular, it's been going on way longer than I think people really know. So I guess do you want to just segue into like when you kind of started to get a feeling of wait a minute, something's awry? And then we get into the division in the feminist movement where suddenly now the issue of transness starts to create this huge divide.
So you can go back in the history of what's called sexology. So the sexologists, which is a subset of psychology, and you can go all the way back to like the year 1900, and there are descriptions in the literature of exactly these men. They are compelled to dress like women. They really want to be women, and it's a sexual fetish. They get sexually aroused at the thought of this. And this is what they want more than anything in the world. So they were called at one point transvestic fetishists because that's what the psychologists observed. So then you get to, that very first experiment where they killed that guy, the Danish girl, the movie that was made about him. Um, and that was in the 30s. So this the sort of procedures start to accelerate and become more refined, so that then you have Christian Jorgensen and a couple of the other Renee Richards, a couple of the really famous ones who hit into the public imagination starting in the late 1950s. It's still at that point called transvestic fetishism. But then they decide to change the name because that just sounds really terrible. It sounds like a sexual paraphilia, which is what it is. So then they said, well, we'll call them transsexuals. All right. So then there's a decade or two where transsexual is now the accepted term in the psychological literature. But that still isn't good enough because you still have the word sex in there, and they need to cleanse that out to make this be accessible. And just to get it into the mainstream, we're going to have to take the word sex out. So then there's this battle behind the scenes to get it called transgenderism. And that's what happens in the 1980s, is that there's this takeover. People need to understand how political these diagnoses are. And I don't just mean in this issue, I mean across the board. And it's like any other, institution that you could name, where it's run by committees, and your goal is to get on the committee so that you can make changes throughout the institution. And this is what happens every time they redo the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And that's like the huge playbook for psychiatrists that lists everything that can go wrong with the human mind, and what we're going to call it, and what the symptoms look like. And every few years they redo it. And it's this huge political process. So the goal was, well, we're going to get enough of our people onto these committees, and then we can get the definition changed. And there's this huge effort to do that behind the scenes, and they're very successful at it. Nobody in the mainstream is even aware of this at this point. Like, it's had no impact on anybody's lives except for some female tennis players. That's it. So in 1979, there's a Dr. Janice Raymond, who's a professor of medical ethics and feminism. She wrote a book called The Transsexual Empire. So this is the late 70s. She saw it coming. And this is an analysis of, ethically, from a moral standpoint, what is happening here? Why are there men who want to have these really invasive, permanent, rather horrifying medical procedures that are going to permanently remove their capacity for sexual pleasure, their capacity to father children? So, their sexual, their reproductive capacities are going to be permanently removed from them. They're never going to look like women. I mean, this is not a thing that medical science will ever be able to do. But, why are we, as a culture, what does it mean that we want to do this to people? And her analysis was that the problem is that we've got these really rigid ideas of what men and women are allowed to be. And so there's always going to be people who reject that. And then we have two options. We can offer them a political movement that will fight for freedom, that will bring down those barriers and let people be more fully human. Or we can keep those barriers in place and say, all right, well, we'll let you do these terrible medical procedures on yourselves, and you can have a very reduced life, always pretending to be something that you're not. When you go out in public, you're going to get clogged. I mean, there's no way to take a male skeleton and turn it into a female skeleton. They're always going to look like men who have had weird things done to them. So which of these is a better option? And she came down, obviously, on the side of feminism and full human liberation, and said, this is just wrong that we are doing this to humans. Like, we shouldn't be doing these terrible medical procedures on perfectly healthy bodies. And we are asking doctors to violate their basic ethics if we are going to put this forward as some kind of a goal, because we've had the Hippocratic Oath for more than 2,000 years, which is first do no harm. And you are clearly doing harm if you remove somebody's genitals for any reason besides cancer. So, why as a society do we think this is a good idea? Anyway, it's a really good book. It has stood the test of time. And she saw that they were poised, that the medical profession was poised to make a lot of money doing this, but that also on a more social level, it was only going to reinforce kind of the worst aspects of a male-dominated society in saying, well, if you're female, you're only this way. If you're male, you're only this way. If you've got any other ideas about who you are, or what you might be, clearly there's something wrong with you, and you need to have massive surgery to fix it. And she was saying it's not possible to have the wrong personality and the wrong body. You've got one of each, and they're fine. They can't have a mismatch. You only get one body. It's yours. You need to live in it. You need to inhabit it. And anybody who tells you otherwise has got a problem. So now, I mean, we've got these two options now before us. We have generally more right-wing people who say, if there's a mismatch between your personality and your body, you need to fix your personality. You need to be a manly man or a feminine woman. Um, those are your options. So go into therapy and fix that on yourself. And this certainly would include a lot of gays and lesbians. You're just wrong. You need to fix it. So conversion therapy, all of that. On the other side now, you've got the more left-leaning people who say, oh, if there's a mismatch between your body and your personality, you can change your body. Clearly your body's wrong. So let's go and have these really horrible procedures done. And I mean on children. We are talking about 12 and 13-year-old girls in the state of California having double mastectomies. Okay. We are talking about puberty blockers on kids who are 10 years old, 11 years old. They've literally never had an orgasm. And if they stay on these drugs, they never will. Okay.
Right.
This is what's happening to these kids. I want people to take this very seriously. This is why we're upset. All right, those are your two options now. There is a third option, and this is the feminist option. From the very beginning, what we have said is it is not possible to have a mismatch between your personality and your body. You can't be in the wrong body. There's nothing wrong with you. And if your culture is telling you there's something wrong with you, you can fight it. You don't have to put up with this bullshit. You're allowed to like flowers if you're a man. You can be a florist. You can be a farmer and grow flowers. You can be a fabric designer and make fabric filled with flowers. It is fine to be that man. You don't even have to be gay to be that man. Just be that man. Colors are pretty. You're allowed to like them. Why are we still arguing about this? And likewise on the female side, please be an engineer, be a skateboarder, be an athlete, be president. I don't care. Be anything you want to be. The point is, it's not possible to have the wrong personality in the wrong body. And that to me just seems so obvious. And the hatred on the left now of just the basic embodiment, the basic animalness of humans has me so depressed. Like that we would do this to children because we hate the idea of just living in our bodies. Um, is just a source of endless grief for me. I don't know how the left got so insane on this issue, but it does not bode well for the future. And it certainly doesn't bode well for the future of these children who, as we have found out, 80% of them, if left alone, would simply be gay and lesbian by the time they reach adulthood. So what we're really doing is once again sterilizing the unfit. We are deciding that there is something profoundly wrong with these kids, and we are removing their capacity for reproduction and for sexual pleasure before they even know what it is, because one day they might grow up to be gay or lesbian. That's what's happening. And the other 20% are largely autistic kids as well. So that's the other. But again, we're sterilizing the unfit. And how people don't see this as, some kind of low-level form of, I don't even know what to call it.
Eugenics.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's not as widespread as that, but yes, that is what this is.
That's
It's certainly
something
the
that I
same
kind of came
mindset.
to the epiphany about, because of one of the things I've noticed, and I mentioned a little bit of this the last time you and I talked, was that it feels like somebody is socially engineering leftist activism to literally just undo itself. And when you think about it, if you were a really bigoted person who hated LGBTQ people, convincing them to sterilize themselves would be a fantastic way to deal with it if you really believed it was some genetic defect, or and that's kind of indirectly what they're doing. They're convincing people who are probably just gay that they need to just sterilize themselves and then everything will be fine. And it's very much a curveball, but in the same way, as I mentioned earlier, the racial activism is now bringing back stigmas about interracial marriage. It's we need to be segregated again. We need, like literally just everything that Martin Luther King did, they're undoing it. And that's when I was like, so now not only are you creating a situation that is drawing way more attention to trans people, in a negative way than ever would have before, which is something, the funny thing is Jordan Peterson actually agrees with most of what you just said. in addition to the fact that he pointed out that there are trans people that contact him that are like, we really just want to be left alone, and we wish that they would just stop, because all they're doing is making it much harder for them. And I get it. And a lot of them, the other thing is that some of them are even completely aware of the fact that they're never gonna be. But those are also the same trans people that are not gonna try to go into your bathroom. They're not gonna try to compete in your sports. They're not gonna do anything that would make you uncomfortable. And that's the weird thing for me that I watched. Was it was a strange transition, because we went straight from like Me Too movement to where and a kind of an environment where the woke version of feminism was so hyper tense that you couldn't even make a girl feel uncomfortable, even if you had zero intention of doing that, even if you didn't do anything sexist, or even if you didn't flirt with them. But if they were uncomfortable, then that was the most paramount important thing in the world. And I'm not saying you shouldn't try to do, make a woman comfortable. But my point is that then we went into, well, but if that person who's making you uncomfortable is trans, then it's all on you. You know, when the
All a
pretty
man has to do is say, "Oh, I'm a woman," and now he's allowed to remove all his clothing and walk around the female changing area with an erect penis, and
right,
nobody's allowed to say anything to him. And this is now happening across the Western world in girls, and I'm talking about teenage girls in their bathrooms. This is now happening to them with teenage boys. And I don't know when in the history of the human race anybody thought this would be a good idea to let teenage boys have access to naked teenage girls. We all know where this is going to end. So there are now, I mean, there was that girl in England who had her nose broken in the bathroom because the boy kicked the stall door in. There's girls all over this country who have these absolute horror stories about what's going on in their schools, and nobody's allowed to talk about it. If you talk about it, you are called a right-wing hysteric. The left just will not conscience that this is actually happening. And then when you show them the incidences, like, okay, there's this one, and then there's this one, and then there's Loudoun County, and then there's this one, and then they completely will shift the goalposts on you and say, well, it's not happening that much. I'm like, how many times does it have to happen? How many
and
girls have to be terrified and sexually assaulted before this is going to matter? Like, is one too many? Is 10 too many? Is you give me the number at which we're going to say this is now a problem, and they won't. They just, it's like they can't. Their little brains explode somehow because they bought this whole ideology that it's actually possible to be a boy in a girl's body or a girl in a boy's body, which is a religious idea because you have to believe in souls, and then you have to believe that they come in pink and blue, and that somehow God or whoever is going to get a mix up. So you've got the pink soul and the blue body and vice versa. I don't believe any of that, and I don't know why I should. I mean, this is just a ridiculous religion as far as I'm concerned. And we've got First Amendment rights. We're not supposed to have a state religion, but this has become the state religion. If you tell your children you don't believe this, they will take your children away from you. And I know parents this has happened to. This is not a right wing crazy conspiracy. This is actually happening in America. If you do not affirm your 14-year-old daughter's belief that she's actually a boy, social services, they are allowed to come and take your child. And some of these stories are absolutely hair raising. What has happened to these girls when they've been taken away?
well, I think
Right.
that one of the
Horrendous.
things about this, and I talk to conservatives about this all the time, is that the far, I guess we'll call them the alt left at this point, that there's this kind of a, what would I, it's like a stage, rather a group of stages or phases. And it begins with, the thing you were talking about is not happening and nobody actually supports it. Then
Right.
it's the, well, okay, it's not happening, but maybe some people do support it. Then the next phase is, okay, well, it is happening, but nobody actually supports it, to finally,
Yep.
okay, no, it is happening and it is supported and you should support it too. You saw that
Yeah.
with the critical race theory in school
Yep.
stuff,
Yep.
and then it's the books that they're talking about. That was the other thing, is that, and I'd be curious about your take on this, because the other thing is that unfortunately, I feel that the sensible LGBTQ activists are also kind of like, what are you guys doing? This isn't a good idea. You're going to make us like, more of a pariah again. You're like undoing the work that we've done, because then all of a sudden, people, conservatives who are at least finally to a point where they were like, all right, look, if you're going to be LGBTQ and you're not bothering me or my kids, we're cool, we're fine, are now going to be in a situation where they feel like they're under siege. And then, as I mentioned in the last episode, worse than that, these people, especially when they're trying to get this stuff in front of young children, we're talking about elementary age, as far as the gender ideology, gender identity, the John Money, Kinsey kind of stuff is finding its way into curriculums for younger and younger children all the time. And then you lie to parents about it. You tell the kids to go ahead and lie to their parents about it as adults that we've put in charge of, of someone else's kids at that point. And that was the one major point that I noticed that was different. So, for example, when they talk about banning books, they usually leave out what's in said books. So Genderqueer is probably not a book that should be in the hands of elementary age kids. It has very graphic depictions of sex acts. So they just say they want to ban books and they leave out the context of what is in said books, right? But I have plenty of friends who are LGBTQ who are like, no, Genderqueer should not be in the hands of a little kid. That's a graphic novel with like depictions of oral sex in it. So do you understand what I'm talking about? Like about how this is in the end of it, unfortunately, going to create more stigma for the LGBTQ activists who had been actually doing a pretty genuine job up until then?
I have to back up one step and say that I do not think there is such a thing as LGBTQ. That a
Okay,
lot of us
fair
in the
enough.
beginning who were LGB wanted nothing to do with the T and the Q. That we saw that our interests were completely in opposition, and that has come true because, like I said, it's mostly gay and lesbian kids who are being sterilized, and that is in the service of the T. The T is incredibly homophobic. This is
Okay,
a
well, no, that's
homophobic
good. Thank
movement.
you, because
So
that's one of the things I needed
there's
clarified.
and some of the people who have fought against this the strongest are lesbian feminists, especially like Jan Raymond, like Sheila Jeffries, who really from like the year 1980 saw what was coming and were willing to analyze it and try to get, some analysis of this into the public.
So
Like
then if we
before
stop
we
with
do this to a whole
LGB,
generation, could we at least talk about it? And nobody
right.
wanted. The T and the Q completely took over. And they took over all the groups that were supposed to be fighting for lesbian and gay rights. So now, when you go to their websites, they don't even talk about same sex attraction. You have to be same gender attracted. And this is why it's deeply homophobic, as well as honestly deeply anti heterosexual. Because I'm assuming you're straight. I don't know, maybe you're bi
Yeah,
or
I
I
am.
don't know what you are, but whatever you are, you're not allowed to be that thing anymore. If you're a straight man, you have to be attracted to men who call themselves women because that's their gender identity. You're not allowed to be attracted to their actual sex or not. You have to accept them. So if men say they're women, you as a straight man have to be willing to date him, and lesbian women have to be willing to date him.
Right. I remember, and that was another one that kind of came off as a little, because it was kind of okay. So when we go back to like the Me Too thing, like one of the things that was commonly a problem was like men trying to pressure women into dating them. Like, you have to be attracted to me, you have to date me, like they're entitled to date you. So then we have a trans person who is now in a position to be able to say that to a straight person or to anyone else. You have to be willing to date me, you have to be attracted to me. Like it's like, how can those two things coexist at the same time? Like, I mean, I'm
Nobody owes anybody sexual attraction. No,
absolutely.
this is not a thing that is like real. Like you're not allowed to do this. But you can find video after video, article after article where they make this claim that it's quote transphobic. If you accept that he's a woman, you now owe him sex. You have to date him. You have to be willing to have sex with him. And I don't understand how people don't see the underlying like rapey tones to all of this.
Yeah, that's definitely. I kind of just looked at it and watched it developing, and I was like, "What are they thinking? This doesn't make any sense." And like, it's a similar thing. Like, I also saw an article. A gay black man wrote an article and stated that white, gay men are not allowed to have racial preferences for dating. And like, what did they say? Well, if you're not, you need to spend more time around black men, then eventually you'll be attracted to them. And I was like, this again just starts to sound like, like I don't have any problem with interracial marriage. And just to be clear, I'll have sex with anyone I'm attracted to, right?
Right.
But at the same time, sometimes the funny thing is, for example, I'm actually usually more attracted to Hispanics, like, for whatever reason, Hispanics, Italians, that skin tone has always been appealing to me. I don't exclusively date white women, but I also don't think that anybody's entitled to my attraction, nor do like,
No.
it's just like, I don't know. The whole thing seems there's so many things about this that I say they eat themselves. It's like you end up in a situation where leftist ideologies start to just turn on each other, and then they'll have these really strange contradictions that just make the entire left look crazy at that point, right? Like, how can you in
Yeah.
one sentence say it's absolutely paramount that a woman always feel comfortable, but then have this huge exception, right? like whereas unless it's a trans person. And like one of my viewers actually brought up the we spa thing, and I studied that very closely. But to those of you guys who aren't familiar with it, it was the we spa was a Korean spa, and Korean spas are nude spas, and therefore they're divided by gender. A
By
pre-op.
sex. They're divided by sex.
Okay, there we go. I'm sorry, Lierre, you'll have to help
No,
me.
everybody does it. This is what's
Yeah,
happened to the language. So it's like we have to catch ourselves. Don't do the gaslighting inside your own head. Like
you
that's
got
what
it.
they've done. They've gotten into our brains.
See, you'll become my feminist therapist for my
No, I'll be like the little angel
deconditioning.
devil on your shoulder going, "Oh, don't say that word. Say this word."
That's awesome. So, but anyway, it was okay. So divided by sex, because people are understood to be nude. Everybody's going to be nude in this place. And so a pre-op trans person showed up, still has their penis, goes in and just, exposes themselves to both, because you have to remember, this is a spa. It's got women and little girls in it. And so what happened next was like this crazy situation where, first of all, the far left and the Antifa violent activists, first of all, stated that it was a hoax and that it had never taken place, right? And then eventually
Yeah,
was
that's always the first. Oh, this never happened.
right, and then it
You
was
can
never
find that
going to
there's footage
happen.
of all the women coming to the front desk saying, "There is a naked man in this spa. You need to do something." And all women of color, right? And they're all saying, especially that one woman who was fantastic, and we've got the footage of them all standing there in a group saying, "There's a naked man in there." No, no, it never happened.
Right. Yeah, it never happened. And this is a right wing, like dog
Conspiracy, crazy
whistling
idea.
conspiracy
Yeah.
theory. This doesn't happen, which is another thing that just destroys the credibility of the left. Is this sort of thing is happening way too often? Is where no, it did. Believe me, it did. Right. So anyway, that happens, and then Antifa shows up, apparently somehow to fight fascism, and
Yeah,
starts
to fight
savagely,
Nazis, to fight
right,
fascism,
to
because
savagely beat up what was, in the beginning anyway, mostly like soccer mom personalities who've never been to a protest in their life, and then some
the
street
footage is
preachers.
you all, if you have not watched the footage from these protests, you need to watch it, because you've got these young men and some of their female supporters, all dressed in black with their masks and their scary gear, and it's just like average women who are like, "Please don't be naked in front of children," and they hound them, they throw things at them, they hit them. The one man knifes another man. Like the violence outside that protest was really horrendous.
Right. And all of that supposedly to
And in
protect
one
people.
direction, let's be very clear. I say this as someone who has spent her life on the left. It's the far left, the Antifa people who are doing this. The right did not bring the violence, the left did.
Right. And that's why I would say that eventually right-wing people did show up, but it was like well into the situation already having started. And the protest initially was just literally people who've like they're not hardlined militant right-wing MAGA conservatives. They were literally like moms, like largely, and I have all the footage of that because I'm friends with Mary Todd, who has a channel that's all about exposing Antifa violence.
Right.
But the point, and I have also was friends with Villain Report. I'm friends with WYSIWYG. These are people literally were physically present and watch what was going on. And WYSIWYG got savagely attacked because that's the other thing. They were also attacking journalists and weren't doing
Oh,
anything
they
to
always
anyone.
do. They
And then
always
they did
do.
attack. There were some bigoted street preacher types that were there, but they weren't hurting anyone. So and they attack those people as well. So the point is that this all goes on supposedly, and then they say that it's a hoax through the whole thing, and then it turns out nope, it was in fact real. And not only was it real, the person is a sex offender, like the person who exposed themselves to kids. So was there any dial back? No, there wasn't.
No.
They're not going to apologize to any of those people, obviously. And what I found really interesting about this, I mean, kind of as a segue, was that, as I've pointed out to trans activists I know, was that if Antifa is going to go do this on behalf of trans people, right there in Los Angeles, MacArthur Park is where MS-13 runs the park, and they stabbed a trans person in the throat. Like, they murder trans people in that, but there's no Antifa showing up over there. And I think it's largely because they know they'll be as dead as fried chicken when people can actually fight back. But the main point, coming back to what we were discussing, was just that yes, this happened, and while they were making the arguments, that's the funny thing is that there were so many people who would finally just kind of say the quiet part out loud, which was, well, even if it was true, you should be okay with it.
Yeah.
Like, I remember there's one really bizarre interaction between my friend Villain Report and this individual female said, I am a woman and I'm trans and I'm non-binary. And I was like, what? Um,
Nonsense.
but
But
as they go on, they're like, if you have a problem with if you're sexualizing someone else's penis, that's on you. Like that. So apparently these moms and their little girls are just supposed to be okay with it because I say so. And if you
they're
don't
like,
like it,
it's rude to stare at other people's genitals. So why are you looking? You shouldn't even have noticed there was a man in there. That's like
right.
their final fallback is, well, it's not, you're the one who's the sick pervert for looking.
Or even for thinking about it or whatever. But it's just that was they basically, it's like you're going to go along with this, and if you don't, we have this violent gang of Antifa who are going to bash you over the head with skateboards outside. And so there were two elements to that I think are a problem. The first of which is obviously I don't agree with violent activism, but it's not just out of a sense of morality. It's because it doesn't, especially in these instances, if you're trying to win hearts and minds, it's not going to work. Nobody's going to become more comfortable with trans people because you beat them up. Like, they may become compliant in that moment, they may become quiet in that moment, but they didn't change their minds. You know, if anything, you're going to get them to double down, right? And so there's that part of the problem, but then there's also part of the problem is that there's this weird kind of like almost trying to brainwash us into believing that these things should just be normal and that there's something wrong with you if you're not comfortable with it. And that was one of the reasons why I was curious how it went down from your perspective being a feminist. And like, do you remember any like distinct moments where you're kind of like, well, I mean, you kind of said you've been looking at this for a while, but when did it become a point where you as a feminist stopped being welcome among feminists?
That would have been sometime in the 1990s, in the late 1990s. In the 80s, I multiple times would go to different women's events, dances, the bars, conferences, whatever. And there was always that guy. One of these dudes would always turn up and try to pretend he was a woman, clearly an autogynephile. He's there for the sexual kicks. And he would be surrounded by a group of women who would lead him out. He's like, you don't belong here. We're not going to put up with this. And everybody understood that he was a skeevy perv who was probably stalking somebody in the room already, and that he wasn't going to do us any good being there. Nobody wanted him in that room. Even if we didn't have the words for it, we understood the nature of these men, and he would be let out of the room, and that would be it. And that stopped sometime in the late 80s. That stopped. What happened was that sort of queer politics took over, and the boundary breaking became the point. And so these men were unleashed upon the world. They were told that any one of their sexual fetishes was perfectly fine, that nobody was going to have any judgment about it, and this is a men's sexual rights movement, is what it is. So, all of that was just going to be normalized. So this was when the queer took over from the lesbian and the gay, and they won. And we were still right, but they won. So by the mid 1990s, you could go to a party like a women's party, a lesbian party, and this happened to me more than once. Everybody in the room would be very excited because somebody was going to be having a mastectomy. She was going to have her breast removed, and everybody would be saying how wonderful this was, and how radical it was, and how great it was. And like three of us would go home in tears because it was so depressing. So at that point, they were pretty much taking over. But it was still kind of like that tempest in a teapot thing, where it was sort of these little subcultures you would find it. It hadn't really spread into the mainstream at all. It took over the kind of the lesbian community, the women's community at that point, but the mainstream really had never heard of it. So that took another decade or two before that got completely insane. And I think the moment for me was when they started putting the serial sex killers in women's prisons, like Robert Koselleck, Michelle, we'll put that in quotes, in Massachusetts. Um, and there's a couple that happened in California too. And I just remember thinking at the time, all right, now the adults are going to step into the room. Somebody with some actual political power, like our legislatures, our senators, someone's going to notice that this is horrendous. And they're going to say, absolutely not. You want to do this crazy shit to yourself? Go ahead. The surgeries are available. You want to pay for it, you go ahead and do this. We can't stop you. You're an adult. But there is no way that we are putting violent male offenders into a women's prison, and nobody stopped them. And that was such a bad moment for me because I realized how much they were going to win. Like that common sense wasn't going to rule the day anymore. That these men were going to get every last thing they wanted, and that's what's happened. And they need the children. Everybody has to understand this. The reason they have gone after the children so badly is because it's the only way for them to have their narrative. And the narrative is they're copying the gay thing of, I was born this way. There's nothing wrong with me. This is not like a sexual thing. There's no transvestic fetishism anymore. That's not a thing. It's not a paraphilia. This is just a perfectly normal way to be. I just happen to have the wrong soul in the wrong body. And we know this is true because tiny little children who are completely non-sexual beings at age 4, they're saying, I was born in the wrong body. And you can watch the whole thing with Jazz Jennings. Supposedly when he was 2, he said something completely ridiculous, which I doubt any 2-year-old could come up with, but his mother insists this is what happened. That's why they need the kids, is because they need to cleanse the sex out of what is essentially a male paraphilia. Autogynephilia is what they actually have. And don't look at the man behind the curtain. That's their whole goal. And they have been very successful at that. So that's why this last decade has been about getting this into schools and getting children on board, taking children who are too young to even understand, or maybe already confused about what it means to be a boy or a girl, or they hate being a girl. Most of these kids have been sexually abused, the boys as well. A lot of them are abuse victims already. Of course, they hate their bodies. And instead of getting them help, we're going to give them surgery because these adult male fetishists need the children to cleanse the sex from transsexualism. So that's why we are where we are.
So, and I think that it was really important, and that's why I'm glad like Gays Against Groomers, for example, exists, that people understand that now I'm going to clip this off the way I'm supposed to, so help me out if I do it wrong. LGB community
Thank
is
you.
like, no, you don't show that stuff to kids. Like, what are you
Yeah.
doing? Like, it's like there was never any kind of, it's not like that part of the problem is that I think that, so pedophilia finds its way into this situation, and then there are people that are trying to join the alphabet soup to allow for quote unquote minor attracted persons to be normalized,
Insane. Yeah.
right? And so the problem then also becomes is that now the whole movement has to be saddled with that nonsense, and there is some pushback, but on the left, the pushback is not very loud, or more importantly, they do the very thing that they always do. Ironically, when you bring up that these things happen, they go, "Okay, now do the Catholic Church." They fly immediately into a whataboutism,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then they try to attack anyone who dares to draw attention to the fact that there are in fact teachers who are using this as an opportunity to get in front of kids, and more importantly, to be in a privileged situation where they are now allowed to discuss topics with kids that would not have been allowed to before. And one of the two things that pops up into my head is that, because I'm a sports coach, we have to go through a certification about spotting grooming behavior. One of those things is discussing sex with someone else's kids in the first place is a red
Right. Right.
flag. And then the second one is, now we're going to showing them graphic depictions is another
Right.
one, right?
Right. But
And
this
that's supposed,
schools are doing this now.
right. And then, like, I noticed, like, on the American Bar Association's website, I mean, mind you, it's a lawyer's website, but they have to have kind of understandings of their definitions, is that it even states in their definition of grooming, this being done even under the guise of education is still grooming, period. So it's like, it wasn't that the gay community wanted kids to be exposed to this stuff younger and younger. There are probably some who do, but it was not the general consensus of the gay rights movements that kids needed to be exposed to this stuff. And it's not just about gay stuff either. It's any sexuality, period. Like, there's an age for that. It's not in elementary school. It's certainly not in kindergarten, and that was kind of understood, and I guess, like, go ahead and share your thoughts on that to make sure I'm not just, speaking for you or anything.
So I want to, I mean, this is like I don't know. This is so heartbreaking for me because a lot of this goes back to the origins of queer theory. And what is considered the founding document of queer theory was an article. It was originally a talk given at a conference at Barnard in New York City, and it's by a woman named Gail Rubin. And the article, it was published as an article later. It's called Thinking Sex. And she lays the groundwork for what was to become queer theory. It wasn't called that then, it hadn't been invented, but she's the one who started to invent it. And it's widely available online. It is considered the founding document. Everybody needs to go read it, because what she's arguing is that, oh God, that the pedophilia is right in there. That men who prefer boys or girls, who prefer young children as their sex partners, are stigmatized, and that this is a terrible thing to do, to stigmatize men who prefer children, and that in fact their sexuality is so stigmatized that no one will defend them. You can find people who will defend communists before you'll find people who will defend, quote, boy lovers, and that this is a terrible problem, and that this stigma has to be removed. So this is where queer theory begins, and it is a project of breaking boundaries, especially sexual boundaries, that there can be no boundaries. You're not allowed to have any, barrier between you and whatever desire you might have. And this absolutely includes children. It's right there in the founding document. And what breaks my heart about it is that she's a woman. You always want women to be better when it comes to children, because mostly they are. It is mostly men who hurt children in these ways. But here you have a lesbian. She's a lesbian, and she's the one who brought this. Of course, based on the work of Michel Foucault, who is the French gay man who also argued for an end to all laws that protected children from adult male sexuality. And he's the founder of postmodernism. And he was, as we know now, absolutely a rapist. He would go to Algeria. He was French, but he would travel to Algeria on a regular basis and rape 10-year-old African boys for money. So that was what he did. And all of postmodernism, as far as I'm concerned, is him trying to defend himself, his own actions, his own desires, because he was not able to stop himself from doing these things. So he decided he would instead try to defend them. And that is what postmodernism is this attempt to say, hey, there's no such thing as power. It just kind of floats around. It doesn't really mean anything. Certainly adults don't have power over children, as I overpower young boys. Oh, and his favorite place to do this was in a graveyard. Could you get more necrophilic?
Yeah, and that was
breaking
something that
every social boundary there is broken.
and I remember that talk that Derek Jensen did, and then like
Yeah.
the students show up to heckle him or whatever, and they're not
yeah.
listening to what he's saying. He's like,
No.
so what
And
part of
these
this are
were
you
people
defending?
who would embrace queer theory, who call themselves queer, and all he's doing is saying, look, this is your lineage. This is what this ideology comes from. These are the founding documents. Go read them. And they do not want to hear it. But
Well,
any
and
of you who
that's
haven't seen it, go find it. It's called Queer Theory Jeopardy, and it's gotten viral a few times. You can go find it on YouTube. Watch the whole talk though, because those kids screamed at him for 2 hours, and he did not give up once. He just kept doing his talk. I was in the front row, so
of
I
course
remember
you
it
were.
well. It was great. He was absolutely stalwart. Like, this is how you behave with these people. And the police were there. They did basically nothing. So it's like, all right, it's up to us to claim our First Amendment rights. Fine, we're going to claim them. Because the police tried to make him stop. They pulled him out of the room at one point, and they're like, we can't control this. We're going to shut it down. And he's like, you're going to have to arrest me. I'm not giving them the win. Why would you do that? This is America.
Right.
We have a First Amendment. I'm giving my talk, so stop me. And he comes right back out and he gives his talk, which was great. So,
Well, at
but
least
yeah,
they
you should
didn't get
watch
their
the
hands on
pedophilia
him,
Jeopardy
because that's
thing.
what they would try to do nowadays. They'd try to
But
beat him
go
up
read
or
Gail
something.
Rubin, and then read the stuff about Foucault as well, because this is where all of this comes from. It's absolutely at the heart of these ideologies, because they're about breaking boundaries, and they're about the sexualization of those broken boundaries. That's
And that
exactly what queer theory is. That's all it is at the end
and
of the
as
day.
somebody brought up in the chat, and I'm working on research right now about this, but and I'm going to forget the fellow's name, which is unfortunate, but there was an Antifa author who was writing articles specifically about fighting fascism, and that stated that the sexualization of children was very important to fighting fascism, because he linked all of fascism to being about sexual repression, and that therefore you should try to expose children to sex as young as possible to protect them from fascism. And I feel terrible for forgetting the guy's name, but he was a mainstream author in like communist circles and Marxist circles. And then, mind you, he was controversial because like the Soviet Union was like, dude, you need to cut it out. Like, that's not okay. But the point is that I haven't been able to get any of them to admit to it. But I was like, this sounds exactly like Antifa's, like what they say to people. It's what they, like they, when they're trying to justify this stuff, it's the quiet part out loud. Is that at the end of the day, there was a reason why they don't want to ever come out and admit this publicly, but there's a reason why they think that kids should be exposed to drag shows. Kids should be exposed to sexuality at younger and younger ages, and that there is actually a belief that this is how you fight fascism, that there is a school of Antifa thought that believes that. And so, and I feel stupid for not being able to remember his name, and I'll probably try to find it at some point during our talk. But the point is that idea that, first of all, that queer theory, as you pointed out, was founded by a bunch of people who thought that there should be no age of consent. I stumbled in my own research onto, it was actually ironically being given to me as part of an argument in favor of this idea. But there's a, well, she calls herself a feminist and gay activist, child educator, specializes in child sex education, was a kindergarten teacher. Her name is Heather Karina, and she's widely, like, she's won awards for what she does. She founded the website Scarletine, which is apparently widely used for sexual education. And she wrote an article named Rage of Consent, which was literally just directly calling for the normalization of sex between adults and kids and how it's beneficial or whatever. But I've tried to give that story to several major outlets and nobody wants to grab it. But I'm like, you need to understand, this woman's books are also finding their way into schools. And she doesn't put that stuff in her books, now, but she does do these like teach-ins and stuff where she teaches people how to run youth groups and things like that. And I'm just thinking to myself in the back of my head, like, is this really the kind of person you want teaching people who have access to children, that this is how you, counsel them about their issues? And it's like, so I'm also, it's interesting because I have to point this out to people, is like, if there are gay kids legitimately, on their own, haven't been groomed to be believed that they are when they're not, those kids should be protected. If there are parents that are abusing their gay kids, we deal with that, right? But I think that this new kind of realm of secrecy, of like acting like you just by default don't tell the parents, is another one of the reasons why this whole thing is tearing up what was becoming, like, I mean, the gay marriage thing, for example, was over and it was done and people just kind of accepted it. They may not agree with it, but nobody was going to fight about it anymore, right?
Yeah, it was a done deal. And everybody's been to a gay wedding, and it's just as silly and as sentimental and as wonderful as every other wedding.
But now,
It's like,
because
what?
of,
It's a wedding. Like, it's going to be all of that at once, and it's fine. And
right,
nobody
but now
cares
we're
anymore.
hearing them
Like,
say,
it
well,
was
we let them have
done.
gay marriage and then now they want this. You see, like, it's like giving them some reason to distrust the entire thing. And I'm like,
Yeah,
no, just
I mean,
leave.
the slippery slope kind of came true.
Right.
And that's why, like, everybody who's like LGB is trying so hard to say, you know what, we got nothing to do with the T and the Q. So you've got like LGB Alliance, you have LGB Fight Back, you've got these other groups that have started because they've had to, because they really have to dissociate from the T and the Q, because that's who's
right.
been in the trouble. It's a completely different worldview. It's a completely different politic. It's a completely different set of public policy, attempts. And I just can't say how strongly, like, the LGB people, if you are listening, you have got to stand up and be counted now. Now, you've got to throw these people out.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I'm glad that we had this conversation, because part of it was for me trying to get some clarity, because unfortunately, um like, like I said, when this all started, like during the 80s, I would have considered myself to be feminist in a lot of ways. I would have considered myself to be supportive of these ideas. And obviously I have, homosexual, lesbian, friends in my life, like it was never going to be a situation that I would ever be against it. But now we've created this situation where the lines are being drawn in the sand. And I feel that the gay people that would not be on board with this, like, that's why, again, like I said, I'm glad Gays Against Groomers exists, because it was necessary to draw attention to the fact that the LGBT movement is not as a whole automatically on board with all of this, right? But I'm concerned about the future, because this is going to create a situation where, just like with the racial activism that I feel is now creating more stigmas about Black people, more division between Black people and white people, or even worse, making it okay to just simply be racist against white people, which science shows in turn will then encourage white people to be racist against Black people. Then now we're going to have a situation where the straight versus gay thing starts to become a problem in a way that it wouldn't need to be if we didn't start including all of this other nonsense. You guys are going to be like blanketly associated with stuff that you don't want anything to do with, that you don't have anything to do with, that you guys recognize, no, children should only learn about sexuality when it's appropriate and when they're at the right age. That, that no, in fact, quite in fact, none of you are supportive of pedophiles. I mean, like, you just openly called it out. It's necessary that people on the right do not allow themselves to become tribal in this situation, and that any kind of any progress that was made in a direction of just a peaceful understanding, like that's kind of what what makes me, what would I say? So, like, the libertarian part of me says, okay, if you're a trans person and that's what you believe, that's how you want to live your life, that's fine. I kind of believe you're allowed to do what you want as long as you don't hurt anyone else. The problem is that there's a component to that, what they're trying to do, that requires other people to change the way that they're living their lives, or what their belief structures are, or what their children's lives are, about, in a way that is coercive. It's not a live and let live. It's a no, now not only do you have to be not, mistreat me, you've also got to go ahead and confirm me. You have to be part of this, you in at every level, you know. And this is what's going to cause more of an enmity. It's going to cause more of a division. And I don't think, again, that's why I said to you guys earlier, was like, it's hard to think this is accidental. Like, somebody has to know that this is the effect that's going to happen, that you're going to destroy legitimate feminism, you're going to destroy legitimate gay activism, you're going to you're going to destroy legitimate racial activism, you're going to undo those things, because the social sciences have understood that that's the effect that happens for quite some time. So that's what worries me more than anything else, is that we gained ground on, from the level of, you're allowed to do your thing and I'm allowed to do my thing. It's no longer like that anymore. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, the new left doesn't seem to want to be okay with what you're doing. Like, now you got to do what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's forced speech. We're all supposed to be using these pronouns, wrong sex pronouns, which I will not do. But this is going to be hitting the courts now. They're trying to make lawyers use wrong sex pronouns. So there's legal cases now about this. And this goes, first of all, directly to the First Amendment. I mean, is the government allowed to force us to say things that are not true? It's not even that we don't believe them, it's that they're physically not true. Like, in reality, they are not true. So that's one level. But I think that part of the problem is that the men in charge of these movements are narcissists. And somebody has even said this in the comments, and I completely agree. What you're seeing is narcissistic personality disorder, just writ large across the culture. And what happens in groups where narcissists take over is that all the good people leave. And what you're left with is a set of very destructive, very controlling behaviors. They're filled with aggrieved entitlement. So they think they're allowed to take whatever they want, and they know how to get what they want. So I mean, you can read Eric Fromm talking about people like Stalin and Hitler and the kinds of personality disorders they had and what they were able to do to entire countries. That's what's happening here. You've got a bunch of people who essentially have that level of psychopathology that are now running everything. And the good people have left because it's unbearable.
And
So I'm not
unfortunately,
willing
they're
to give
exactly
up.
the kind of people who need to stay.
Yeah, I know. That's always the problem, right? Is
And
what you need is the good people, and they're the ones who are like, I can't take this anymore, and they just
that's
retreat.
that's like the sociologist I told you about, Dr. Turner, who's leaving sociology, even though it's been his lifelong passion, because he's just given up. And it's like, no, you can't let them have sociology. That's how we decide how people work. They can't
Yeah.
have it and then just be able to write books any way they want about it. So um I want to make sure, because obviously we're getting up to an hour, and I want to be sure that you have had an opportunity to share everything that you feel is important on this topic. So go ahead and just like go over anything that you feel that maybe is not getting enough attention.
So you and I might not agree about this, Neil, and that's perfectly fine. I still like you. I think you're doing great work in the world. I so appreciate so many of the videos of yours that I've watched have been incredibly helpful to me. So having said that, I don't think there's such a thing as a quote trans person. There are men and there are women, and that's it. And I think it's perfectly okay to say that out loud. I think we all know that. I think the evidence of our eyes tells us that. The human infant can tell the difference between a male and a female face. A human infant. The moment their eyes are up to focusing, they know who's male and who's female. And they overwhelmingly prefer, guess who? The female face. Mom, food, security. They know who is who. And that doesn't leave us. That's what we have our whole lives. We can tell the difference between men and women. We have different skeletons. We have different voices. We have different joints. We move different. We speak different. We have different fat and muscle pat. There's no way. There's not a human being on this earth who does not know the difference between men and women. Women give birth. Men do not. We all know this. And there's this like mass gaslighting going on where we're supposed to pretend that nobody knows the difference. We all know the difference. And it is not complicated. Biological sexual reproduction has been a feature of life for 2 billion years on this planet. 2 billion years. It is older than the rings of Saturn. It is older than forests and trees. That's how long this goes back. So we know the difference between men and women. Are there men who want to be women? Yes. And that's their problem. It's not for me to figure out what is wrong with them or to help them.
And
At
there are
a
women who
certain
want to
point,
be
I
men
might have
too.
offered them some compassion, but they're not asking for compassion. What they're
No, they're
asking
not.
for is submission, and they cannot have it.
And I want to clarify, I'm kind of on a personal journey of trying to understand what's going on with it. I know that I have trans people in my life, and there's one of them in particular that was once a very dear friend of mine, and now I notice that they've divorced themselves pretty much for their entire life. It's almost like it's not just a matter of they changed, like they don't talk to their family, they don't talk to their previous friends, they don't talk. It's almost like they've just been absorbed.
Into a
Um,
cult. Yes, they
right.
have.
And I want to
Yeah.
be clear, like I'm never going to say anything like about the biological differences, like obviously because I'm a sports coach, and the only time I've ever been doxxed and had my life threatened in my life was for making videos about the very real science about that topic, right? So I guess what I want to get at is that there's a libertarian understanding of, okay, I don't necessarily agree with what you're doing, but if you're not hurting me, that's your own business. That's the direction I'm still kind of leaning, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with where they're coming from. Like that's what I'm getting at, is that part of the problem is that there's very little way to test this theory. Like I had somebody in my chat recently in Discord say, well, here's the study that shows that trans people's brains are more like the identity that they believe they are, right? That they're doing brain scans and finding this. So my response to them was, okay, well, let's because I looked at the test. It was a very small sample, right? So it's like, okay, that's not enough for me. But let me ask you this: if that's true, then would you be okay with stating that only people whose brain scans show up this way begin, transition? And they were not on board with
No,
that.
of course not. Because
Right.
they know it's bullshit.
Right. And that's what I'm getting at is that if it came down to it that somebody could be like that. The other thing I would also say is that even if I believed it was true, it would be a very tiny percentage of the population, even into the more conservative understandings of it. So it's like, I guess what I'm getting at is that one of the reasons why I do things the way I do is that first of all, I try to avoid talking about a topic that I haven't heavily researched, as I think you've probably seen since you like some of my videos. But it's also a matter of like, some of these things seem to still be in evolution. I mean, if you think about it, there was a time when people had similar thoughts about gay people, that we're currently saying about trans people, as far as, well, this doesn't exist, this isn't real, this is a choice. And so therefore, I'm kind of quietly waiting to see how it all plays out. But that also leads me to have conversations like the one I'm having with you, to learn more about this topic before I come to any kind of conclusions. But I know one thing for sure: girls shouldn't have to tolerate a boy in their locker room if they're not comfortable with it. I know that girls divisions for sports were created due to biological realities, not how somebody felt.
Right.
That the fight for women's sports is not even over. Like they're still not completely, like the feminist, work on that is still not even done. And now we're like throwing that, because like, especially in wrestling, this is one of the reasons when they discuss the trans athletes and sports thing, I just kind of roll my eyes. I'm like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Like, they're like, well, let's just have weight classes. I'm like, my daughter wrestled boys her whole life. I can assure you, weight classes isn't enough. Like it, and they don't. There was a graphic that was being shared by the Washington Post a long time ago that they have since deleted the article that just went down the basic differences between the
Yeah.
heart, between the
Yeah.
lungs, between the
Yeah.
muscle fibers. Now you're not allowed to talk about that, right? Like they censored themselves, and so that's what I'm saying is that, and I'm really happy that you said that you may disagree with me about it and you still want to talk to me about it, because that's actually more important to me on this channel. Is that, I'm sure you and I are not going to agree about everything, but we can have a good conscious conversation about it. And I think in the long run, you and I probably agree on a lot more than we disagree about. But
Probably.
so what I was explaining though is just to say is I'm not as, it kind of comes down to this. If somebody is wanting to have a lifestyle for themselves that isn't hurting anyone else, then that's kind of a libertarian principle. That doesn't necessarily mean I biologically think that what they're going through is real, and I'm waiting for more information on that. But in the certain biological realities that we currently have, those are not in question. Like that's, and regardless of any of that, to try to force other people to go along with something. That was the other thing that kind of concerned me, was that I also know trans people that I've met who are not well adjusted at all. In fact, like I had a roommate once who was trans who was on the testosterone. And at one point I was just eating at my table and they got up with their fist clench and said
Mhm.
something about the way I was chewing made them want to punch me. Like I didn't have my mouth open or something. I'm just like, I turned and looked at them like,
Oh, God.
are you okay? Like it was, the stuff was making them psychotic. Like it was,
It
something was
does
not
that. It
right.
does that. I mean, there's literature. We've known this for decades. It will make some percentage of women go psychotic, that
Right.
level of testosterone. We
And
don't
that's
have the receptors for it. She has no way to absorb it into her body like a man does. She doesn't have a male body. She
right.
has no need for that level of testosterone.
And I kind of got to a point where I realized, it was like, well, I've met some that seem to do okay and some that don't, but the one that I know that did okay, well, they have cancer, and
Right, which you're gonna get from taking that level of wrong sex hormones. That is a
right.
feature of this, liver cancer especially, yeah.
And then the other thing was that at my core, I'm really big on science. And then when I had Brett Weinstein on, he has statements about both the issue about how to handle the pandemic and the vaccines, but also about this issue. And he points out very clearly, and this is just kind of basic understanding science 101. You cannot make statements about the long-term safety of something that hasn't been done long-term.
Right.
You cannot make, okay, we know this is safe 10 years from now. If it hasn't been done, you can't. Like it's literally scientifically impossible. So those are the kinds of red flags that got me involved in this, was when people, first of all, they will lie and claim the science is on their side, which is what I encountered with the trans athletes in sports. And then if you bring up the truth, that's what led to them needing to threaten to kill me and my family, was because I was telling the truth. It wasn't because I was lying. I make
Mhm.
it very clear in all my videos, look, I have no ill will towards these people if they're not hurting anyone, but here's the reality, right? And that was the reason why I have these conversations. And it's also why I wanted my audience that has right-leaning and left-leaning people to hear from you directly as an actual, um, member of this community who has seen it evolve from the beginning, because they need to know, Lierre, that there are still people on the left who do not agree with this. That please don't hate all feminists because you met some crazy feminist who thought
Yeah,
that they
please.
needed to beat someone up for using the wrong bathroom, or not being allowed to use the bathroom or whatever. Like
Ah,
that's real, and that was kind of what this is about. And I thank you so much for your time. I wanted to make sure that, and I think that we covered most of what we wanted to cover. And you guys don't forget to check out Lierre's stuff at lierrekeith.com. If you're interested in learning more, I do have left-leaning listeners who just tend to be a bit more quiet, who have already inquired about you. So, um, go ahead.
I got one more place to go, which I don't even care about me, but my organization is called Women's Liberation Front, WOLF. is our acronym, and you can go to womensliberationfront.org. Especially, we need help supporting the lawsuits that we're doing. We are suing the state of California for putting violent male offenders into the women's prison here, and what's happening to the women is completely horrific. So you can go to our website, you can read the women's own words about what it's like there now, how horrible it is, how nobody believes them, nobody cares about them. And we're the only group that's doing this. So if you want to stop putting male offenders in women's prisons and you want to help sue the state of California, please go take a look. We would love your help, your support, your donations, whatever you've got. We've got to get it done because there's nobody else going to stand between some pretty awful levels of harm and some of the most vulnerable women in the world.
So actually, a question from the audience: were you at the Seattle Public Library Wolf Talk pre-pandemic?
Yes, I was. You can watch the footage of me speaking. I was there.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that you guys, or gals, as the case may be, weren't you going to be having like a big protest at the United Nations? I thought I saw
We
something.
did, yeah. We did great. We had a fun time.
And well, okay, and something that just kind of popped into my head about this, which is I think is kind of vitally important, is it comes back to something that happened at Occupy. There was a moment where Ron Paul told the Tea Party that they needed to meet with us about our common opponents. And I think, like, do you feel that the feminists that you work with are going to be in a position where they're going to be able to stomach perhaps that maybe sometimes they might have to stand next to somebody who's maybe not pro-choice, for example, because you agree on this thing? Like, is that a thing that can happen?
Well, it is happening because it has to happen. But also, I would say that throughout most of the history of every democracy, that's just how politics gets done. Like, we're not actually doing something weird. That's literally how laws get passed, is that people talk to each other in places like Congress and they find common cause and they get it done together. And there are plenty of laws that have passed because both people on the left and people on the right decided it was a good thing and we can work together. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a government that functioned. So, the more that we get siloed from each other, the less we are able to get anything done in terms of our common affairs. So, we're just doing the thing that really men have always done. And when they do it, they're called great statesmen. So we're just doing the same thing. So sometimes, yes, we have to work with Republicans. The liberals are the ones who brought this problem, and they're certainly not going to solve it. So we don't really have much choice. What I will say, though, is that it's mostly women on both sides who are working on this. And that's been great. I have got to meet a bunch of women I never would have met before, and it's really interesting to talk to them and see where we agree and where we diverge. And that's always good for everybody. I don't want to just talk to people who agree with me all the time. You get very stale that way, and you can get very rigid and very fundamentalist, honestly. And that's never a good place for the human mind to go. We need to keep engaging if we are going to stay alive, and we need to keep engaging if our country has a future. So keep talking to everybody. That's the most important takeaway point.
And I think that's extremely important, and I try to emphasize this on this channel a lot. And I have a conservative viewership that is well aware of the fact that I voted for Bernie Sanders in 16 and 20, and they're still willing to listen to me. I have left-leaning people who also kind of feel like put out, like, what the heck? Like, look, man, I still advocate for like Medicare for all and all that, but where the hell do I go? Because there's nowhere to go, right? It's
Yeah.
almost like,
Yeah.
and in the end of my goal was to try to create situations like this. Like, my Derek Jensen conversations were very popular with my audience, as another example. Even the ones on the right were like, yeah, that was a good talk. That's what I'd like to see more of, is people saying
Yeah.
this was a quality conversation because these two people exchanged ideas and dialectic, and we're trying to learn from each other. And so I want to thank you very much for coming on. I'd like to talk to you super briefly off the air, if that's okay with
Great.
you.
Sure. I'll hang on.
And then everybody, guys, thanks for tuning in today. And if you like this conversation, I have more like this. You should also check out the previous episode that I did with Lierre just a couple days ago. Is available on my channel if this is the first time you've tuned into this, where she kind of goes over the more of a history of the feminist issue. And then we talk a lot about issues on the left in general. The majority of my content is not really geared towards making arguments about right versus left, although the far alt left would probably tell you that. Because I do often call out the left when they do something crazy. But I think that's another part of like what I just said recently, because I just did a video specifically about what they think the political compass looks like, is that there's this tiny little green box in the upper left that is the left, and then everyone else is far right. So somehow you're far right too, by the way, because you don't go along
Oh
with the
yeah.
trans stuff.
Oh
Right.
no, I'm definitely a Nazi, 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 Nazi. I've had that screamed in my face. So yeah.
Right. I'm sure you'd fit in really well, right? It's so anyway, guys, thanks again for tuning in. Do be sure to check me out on hy.page/vradio. There you can find me on Rumble, on Odyssey. My channel is definitely, while I'm still monetized somehow, I'm definitely shadow banned. So please share my stuff as much as you can. And join us in Discord where we have conversations like this. Just be ready for the fact that if you go into Discord, there's going to be very heated topics, I guess would be the way to put it. Just no personal attack, period. Like, you're allowed to say whatever you want. I mean, I had to argue with a Christian theocrat the other day, but they were being polite. So I was like, okay, so you believe it's okay to, well, write the Constitution according entirely to your religion? Like, I had to argue with somebody I don't agree with, but we didn't attack each other. And that's why it was beneficial. Thanks again for everybody for tuning in. And I really, really appreciate all of you. Join us in Discord.